Surprise, I'm here. I was not supposed to lead today. Phil, this guy Phil was supposed to do it. And if you haven't, is he online? Okay. I was going to let him speak to you himself. Phil will have surgery today at 12 on his Achilles on his right leg. He, if you didn't hear it, hurt himself this weekend, got too rambunctious with trying to play pickleball with, as my doctor said, people of certain ages shouldn't do certain things, and he did anyway. So anyway, he has a tear. It's not a complete rupture, but he is going to have surgery today, and so we want to keep him in our thoughts and prayers, and we'll have a prayer for him and with him if he's going to join us sometime this morning with that. So anyway, fortunately, he had already done some on the PowerPoint for today, and so I kind of took what he started with, and then we'll go from there. He did want to remind you about the great day of service, which was already just mentioned by Brian on that. So we're going to continue today with Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. We're in the first chapter, the 20th through the 25th verses today. Actually, we're going to start with the 18th verse and go on with that. But as Phil has reminded us, Paul's letters were usually written to either lift up a community or to give information to a community or scold a community with this. And so the folks at Corinth are one of those groups that he's having some challenges with. And as Phil's already mentioned to you, he even said last week, I'm so glad I did not baptize you guys because, you're not really living up to what the gospel proclaims. And so, but it was primarily to churches that he had visited, some he had started. Most of the time he's trying to resource and be helpful to them. A lot of the people are new to the faith. They have questions about things. You have churches that are forming that are primarily out of folks who come from the Jewish synagogue tradition. In the Jewish faith, you have churches that are Gentile in their base. You have some that are combinations, and they're all trying to figure out what we're supposed to do. How are we the church, and how are we supposed to be the church? Do we carry all the stuff over that we did in the synagogue, or are we supposed to do things in a different way? And so that's what Paul is trying to do. If you remember, he showed you this map last week about the distance from Athens to Corinth in Greece. And it's interesting, it's 52 miles from downtown Athens to Corinth, but sometimes it takes 2.5 hours to get there. You think about traffic in Atlanta, getting out of Athens is a chore and a half, even if it's on a good day. And so I thought it was interesting when I looked it up, it said, 1 hour and 5 minutes or something like that. I'm going, yeah, right, with that. So sometimes it would take 4 hours to get there, but you can see it's not that far. And so I showed you this map too, which I thought was interesting. To look at. It gives you a pretty good representation of what we're thinking about as far as this area as it relates to the church at Corinth. And you'll see where Athens is. Achaia is the name of Greece at this point in time, or one of his ancient names with that. And interestingly, the area was developed way back in 6500 BC. In this area, there's evidence of folks having lived there at that time. And so through history and time, it was a place that was, you can see, strategically located. And so in 146 BC, Rome defeated the legion of armies that are in that area and took over. And the city, even though it was captured by the Romans, they really didn't do much with it. And so for the next 100 years, it kind of lay dormant. until Julius Caesar decided that he was going to rebuild it. And so in 44 BC, he began a major building plan, and then he got assassinated. And so it was one of those things that he got things going. The new city was primarily populated by what we would call freed men. And this was those persons who had been slaves or who had been conscripted into the army or whatever. And he used that group of people as a nucleus to begin this new city and to revamp it. And so he put them to work building and getting things started, and they developed the government and all those kinds of things. So the new city was primarily filled with folks like that. And it grew and it grew and it grew, and it became a city of Romans, Greeks, and Jews. It was a huge Jewish population there. And so Paul was one that wanted to visit there and be able to spend time with them. And so he did that. But anyway, but you'll notice that the city also is on a port, but it's not on one port, it's got two ports. And we're going to talk about that in a second. This was a strategic location. The city was largely created by this group, but there was also, it was a sailor's town. I mean, there were people that came from all over the world. This is strategically located, related to about halfway from Italy to Turkey. And this was the kind of halfway part of the trip. And so this became an area of great wealth and great commerce with that. And so unfortunately, it also fell upon a difficult time, as we've evidenced in Turkey this week, prone to earthquakes. And so there were a couple of earthquakes in 365 and in 375, and then a major earthquake in 865 that killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 45,000 people. I mean, it was just a major event, and it's created with that. And ultimately, the city was taken over by the Normans in 1147, and basically the country, or that area city, just never really developed like it had been beyond that. And so for that reason, we have the development of it. But we move to the next one, and I wanted to show you this one. You see the isthmus that is there, which is, you see that's line right across here. And that is actually the Corinth Canal. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of that. It was used as a way to develop the area. At the time of Paul, Corinth was the largest city in southern Greece. It was the largest and the most influential. It had over 760,000 people. And on this map here is 4 miles from here over here. And this whole area was developed into the city of Corinth. And so it was a huge area, had 2 main ports that you can see. We had the first one up here on the north end, and then we also have on the southern end. So you have a port from the Aegean Sea to the Ionian Sea. And so in this area then serves both of those. It's international trade is taking place. You're getting people that are coming in. It's just one of those cities that just was in the right place at the right time, and it just bustled and it just grew like crazy. And so it was became very instrumental then in Greece. And merchants, adventurers, refugees, retired veterans from the army, all of that was happening here. And so you can just imagine with the influx of people, especially during the seasons in which you could travel, this was a city that was kind of nonstop. You know, you hear about New York, you know, it never sleeps. Well, that's the way Corinth was. And for a lot of the good reasons, but also for not some of the so great reasons also. And so it was basically, imagine, if you would, Mardi Gras 24 hours a day. This was, sailors that had been out to sea for months. They find their way into the port. It's got everything you could think of to do. And so it just was bananas all the time with that. And so the sailors' town with that. And so the challenge that the church had there, of course, was the reality that it was not a great place to be at times. There were so many problems with it, so many things happening. But I wanted to show you a closer look. This is a satellite picture of the canal. As we said, 4 miles long, is 80 feet wide. So it's not a huge thing, and it was used to connect the Ionian, as we said, the Ionian and the Aegean Seas. It separates the Peloponnesian Peninsula and the Greek mainland, and that was one of the challenges with it. It almost felt like then that the peninsula became an island to itself, and there was a lot of concern about that before this canal was built. Was, is this going to cut us off from everybody else? But it turns out it didn't. But it also created this way of getting goods from one side to the other. It separates the peninsula, and then the construction actually this is a modern invention. With that, it was started in 1881 and actually finished construction in 1893. And so, but the interesting thing was, if we remember that picture, if we go back to the one before this, you can see that you got the peninsula, and go back one more then to the other picture. And you can see to go from that isthmus all the way around to the other side is 150 miles sailing. And so this 4-mile piece of land then became a gateway to allow goods and services to be back. So if you go back to the picture there with the canal, you can see that this is cut off as a way to allow that to take place. Today, the modern city of Corinth is right here. Before that, it had been 3 miles away, and unfortunately, again, earthquake in 1880 something, I can't remember the year now, created the problem of having to close the city down. But I wanted to show you a picture I took at the canal, which is there. So you get this sense that this is standing on one of the bridges that goes across, and you can see all the way from the Ionian to the Aegean Sea here, and it gave ships a chance to get through. The original idea, interestingly, for this canal was created in the 7th century BC. Why can't we find a way to connect these two bodies of water and save all the challenge of going around? And so there was an individual who did that. They figured out that even though they could not cut the canal through at that time, there was concerns about, what if we cut the canal through and the whole body of water, whole mass of land falls over? Or what happens if we cut this thing through and then the whole land gets flooded? There was a concern that on one side, the sea level is at one level, on the other side, it was another level, and there's no locks in this thing. So what happens if it all falls apart? And so they were hesitant to do it. But they did decide that even if they couldn't do the canal, that they would actually build a road of portage. And so you could do one of two things. If you had smaller ships, you could take them out of the water and roll them across the 4 miles of land. Or you could unload everything off the ship and then port it over to the other side 4 miles away and put it on a different ship to go away. So there was lots of ways of getting around it with that. But finally, it was decided that the idea was in the 7th century BC, we would do this canal. Well, then Julius Caesar decided that it was something that he would want to do as a way to help. And so he decided, yes, we're going to do the canal. And then he was assassinated. And then Caligula says, yes, we're going to do the canal. And he was assassinated. And so then Nero ultimately says, we're going to do it. And so in 67 AD, Nero says, yes, let's do the canal. And almost as soon as they put the shovel in the ground, he died. Would you want to do the canal? It was one of those things, okay, maybe this isn't such a great idea after all. And so for that reason, the canal was put to rest, at least for a little while. And then again until the 1800s with that. So anyway, the next picture here is actually of a ship being towed through the canal. One of the things that they did figure out early on, the canal is only 80 feet wide. And so ships cannot be more than 58 feet wide to get through. But one of the things they realized was if the ships went through on their own power, the weight that would be created would destroy the sides of the canal. And so they had to be pulled through initially. And so they had a way that they set it up so they could be pulled through with ropes and then using carts and whatnot to pull it. But then, of course, when tugboats came around, they decided that was the best way to do it. So now if you go to the Corinth Canal, you have a chance to see them actually pull these through. And it was based on, again, the size of the ship. It takes about an hour for the tug to pull it from one side to the other because it has to go very, very slowly to keep the erosion from affecting the side of the canal. And so they do that. But the city itself is a hustling and bustling place. It's very, very prominent in that the Acrocorinth was a walled city that was on the Acropolis of the city. Now, the Acropolis, we often think of as the place in Athens. We're going to the Acropolis. Well, it was an Acropolis because any city that had a city or a fortress or whatever built on the top of a high hill that it's centered around is an Acropolis. So it's not a single place. It is the place in the city that is elevated. And so with that, the Acropolis is created here in Corinth also. And it was just by definition, in the Greek and Roman times, it was a settlement on a high hill with that. And the Acropolis here is 1,500 feet above the city and almost 1,900 feet above sea level. So it is highly elevated for this area. And most of the time, an Acropolis would either have a fort or would have religious centers or would have cultural centers that would be on top. It would kind of be like going to the amusement park, whatever, on the top of this mountain, because everything, again, that you would need would be there. And interestingly, as you would suspect, the people that lived up there were mostly the wealthy and the religious leaders, and then those who provided the services and goods for those folks. And so the expectation of people who live, you almost had to be invited to live in the Acropolis. It was a fortified area, and so you had to be somewhat select to be able to live there. And so the assumption of, and the way it was set up by the people who lived on the top of the Acropolis, was to be that the people in the valley, the people at the foot of the mountain, would be the ones that would bring you whatever you needed. So they would hire you to be the deliverer of goods and services. And so they also expected that if somebody came and wanted to threaten the area, who was supposed to fend them off? The people living down below. And sometimes, again, they were instructed to do that. Sometimes they were paid to do that with that. But on this particular Acropolis, at the top, there's the Temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And this was the largest temple brothel with temple prostitutes in the world at the time of Paul. And so you have over 1,000 prostitutes that are also on the Acropolis that are available for your purchase as you would like. with that. And so that's one of the reasons that Paul spends a lot of time talking about the different types of love that they are. He also spends a lot of time talking to us about the value of our human bodies, and how we should not desecrate them with that, because, and it also was the center of athletic games. There was 5 areas in Greece where the Olympic type game took place. And so one of those places was Corinth. And so not only did you have this hustle and bustle of all the sailors, you had the entertainment, you also had a lot of athletic competition going on. So another reason that Paul is talking about the significance of the human body and how we're supposed to take care of it. And then just a few other things. This is the temple of Apollo. One of the things about a city of this size was, you would assume, there are lots and lots of places to worship, to make your offerings. And you're having people coming from all over the world who are coming with different religious backgrounds, to having different experiences of faith in whatever way it might express itself. And so there were all kinds of places to worship there. And so the Temple of Apollo is one of those. This is the Agora. This is the shopping area that also had a public bath. And that's what you're looking at where those pillars are. This is the public bath area. You've been on a ship for a couple of months, having a nice hot shower and having a time to get clean and get yourself beautified before you go to the Acropolis and take advantage of what is there. You would get yourself ready to go. And so we did that. But one of the things that they found in part of the excavation that they did there is that this is Julius Caesar. This is a statue of Julius Caesar. And one of the things you'll notice about the statues in many places in the world that have been excavated is that you often find them without arms and without heads. Why is that? 2 reasons. One is that is when you have a group coming through that takes over the city, either through war or through some kind of pillaging of the area, is one of the ways you demoralize the people is that you behead and decapitate the leaders. And so you just remind people, you got this statue, the head's gone, the arms are gone, and that's what could happen to you too with that. But it also was an economic thing in that they would have these statues and they would have removable arms and heads. So if the leader changed, then you just have to do a head and a couple of arms. You don't have to worry about doing a whole statue anymore. And so it was, you can see a little bit here, kind of down this way, there's a seam. And what they have done is put this head upon this particular statue. But this is Julius Caesar. This is Nero, that also was found in that location. It's a wonderful, wonderful museum there that allows us to see all that. So anyway, basically that's the lead in, and we're going to go through the scripture here fairly quickly because I think you're more familiar with that anyway already. Paul was creating a new church kind of in the worst place you could ever start a church, or maybe it's the best place to start a new church, and that is in the middle of everything. That is in the middle of all the things you can imagine a major city would have to offer, both in good and bad. And so he is creating a city or a church here, and there's plenty of ministry to be done. And one of the things I didn't show you, there's a bema also that they have unearthed, excavated in Corinth, that is basically the preaching place. It was in the middle of the agora. The shopping area. It's in the middle of the mall. And instead of having a kiosk where you could buy things, Paul had this place that was a bema. It was the place that you could stand and you could proclaim and you could talk. And Paul used this as a way of doing that. There was also a synagogue that was there that was huge at the time, but he also created a Christian church. Paul found out very early in his ministry that when he went from place to place, he initially went to the synagogue and used that as a place to preach if he could. But a lot of times they would say no. And so he kind of, by this point in his ministry, is really focusing on the Gentiles. And so they have created a church here. And so this is the place that is very prevalent with that. And there's plenty of ministry that the church can do. And with that, he raises some pretty alarming issues. And we've talked about some of those already briefly with that. But John Wesley talks about this, and I thought this was a great quote. Phil put this in here, and I appreciate it. It says, "But how early did the mystery of iniquity work, and how powerfully in the church of Corinth? Not only schisms and heresies, animosities, fierce and bitter contentions were among them, but open and actual sins." I mean, everything's out there that you can see. "Yea, such fornication as was not named among heathens." This is even beyond what heathens would do. If you want to be bad, just get beyond where the heathens are with that. "Nay, there was a need to remind them that neither adulterers, nor thieves, nor drunkards could enter into the kingdom of heaven." And so, the word was proclaimed in a way that would be helpful to them. But there was also something that Paul talked about there too, and that is the true wisdom in the power of God in the cross. The foundational truth of the Christian faith was in Christ's resurrection. And so Paul talks a lot about being crucified with Christ. What does that mean? As Christ was crucified for us, and we are a part of that crucifixion, we look for what that can be for us. And so the whole resurrection is a significant part of Paul's proclamation. The unity of the church, we've talked about this. He has spent how much time in what we know now is 1st and 2nd Corinthians, talking about the significance of Christian love and what that means. The unity of the church, the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, and the principles of the Christian faith and Christian ethics. All of those things are Paul just saying over and over and over again. And even though we have letters that later address that, that's got to be, Phil was talking on Sunday about he has 3 signature sermons that he gives, and that's kind of Paul. Paul keeps reiterating over and over these kinds of things. And so we have that happen. And so the highest of all this is he talks about the love of God and the grace that we find as a part of that. So looking then on to Andy, tell you what, let's go on down to the message. Let's start with that. So in 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, 18th through 25th, the message points, the message that points to Christ and the cross seems like sheer silliness to those hell-bent on destruction. So if somebody's made up their mind, this is how the life they're going to live, then it's kind of silliness to try to talk against them because they've already made up their minds. But for those on the way of salvation, it makes perfect sense. So if you have decided that you are acceptable of what is being offered to you, then in the faith, we do that. This is the way God works, and most powerfully, as it turns out. It is written, "I'll turn conventional wisdom on its head. I'll expose so-called experts as shams. So where can you find someone truly wise, truly educated, truly intelligent in this day and age?" So what about wisdom? Where does it really come from? And hasn't God exposed it as pretentious nonsense? If you rely only on the wisdom that you have, then that's still not going to get you where you need to go. Since the world in its fancy wisdom never had a clue when it came to knowing God. God in his wisdom took delight in using what the world considered stupid preaching of all things to bring those to trust him into the way of salvation. So how simple preaching can be to make a difference in the lives of people in a way that they will transform their lives. And then it goes on to say in the 22nd verse, while Jews clamor for miraculous demonstrations and Greeks go into philosophical wisdom, we go right on proclaiming Christ, the crucified. So again, if you can get into philosophical decisions, you can get into philosophy, you can get into wisdom, but the bottom line is of it all is that Christ is crucified on our behalf. So Jews treat this like anti-miracle, and Greeks pass it off as absurd. But to us, who are personally called by God himself, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is God's ultimate miracle in wisdom, all wrapped up in one. Human wisdom is so cheap, so impotent, next to the seemingly absurdity of God. Human strength can't begin to compete with God's weakness. Now, that's a great statement, isn't it? The human strength, as strong as it can be, can't even deal with the weaknesses of God with that. And so the problems that we run into with Corinth, obviously, then, is this long list of things that Paul has talked to us about. They embraced the values that the Roman society took on, which divided over things that didn't really make a whole lot of difference. You had teachers teaching, and the teachings that they taught, you had house churches, you had incest, lawsuits among believers, sexual immorality, marriage and issues that went with that, food offered to the idols, what are you going to do with that? And then head coverings. All these things were things that kept coming up as stumbling blocks in the midst of the church. And so the division that takes place is with Jews and Gentiles. There was issues related to social rankings that people had, related to wisdom and foolishness and powerful versus the weak, noble birth versus low and despised people. All those things go into what it made for Paul. And then ultimately, the Roman culture valued polished rhetoric and regarded the message as basically folly. The crucifixion of the Messiah, how can that make any difference in our lives? So anyway, I think we'll stop with that. Let's go on to the questions. You'll see the questions on your table today with that. So if you want to go ahead and take a look at those for the time we have. It took a little longer, but I thought it was helpful to look at all that stuff too. So go ahead amongst yourselves at the